We fade in, and we see a black and white rural scene to the sound of a Russian folk song. A family and a dog walk forwards, looking occasionally behind them. They suddenly stop walking as the Russian song is slowly taken over by another sound, the sound of Verdi's Requiem. They slow down as the folk song, still barely audible, fades into the increasing tones of the Verdi Requiem. They move hesitantly, changing position barely discernibly until the scene is frozen into a still. This is the opening of the 1983 film Nostalghia, my favourite film by Russian director Andrei Tarkovsky. And though we don't yet know it, from these opening minutes we already have all the information we need to understand this film. Now, in this video essay there will be spoilers, so if you haven't yet seen it, then I would encourage you to take some time to go and watch it from fresh and then come back. But if you've either seen the film, or haven't and don't mind, or are happy to have some more background for understanding it, then stick around as we're going to take a look into the musical world of Nostalghia. We open to a misty, desaturated scene. We could be anywhere. Nothing about this is immediately recognizable. We are, however, in Italy, in Tuscany of all places, though nothing in this Italy is familiar to our typical postcard vision of the bright golden Tuscan countryside. We already feel strangely disconnected. A confident young Italian woman with wild hair walks out enthusiastically, mentioning how the beauty of the Italian countryside reminds her of the Neskuchny garden in Moscow. A man gets out but doesn't want to follow. He's reluctant, clearly ill at ease. He replies to her in Italian before talking to himself in Russian. He is Russian, she is his Italian interpreter, and they are there to look at the frescoes of Piero della Francesca. But for some reason he has changed his mind and doesn't want to go. The next 5 minutes is an intimate mixture of rituals, reflections, and sound. It's so quiet that we hear everything. Clothing, footsteps, bells, wood. We hear the echo and reverberation within the space. It's so immersive that we almost feel like we are there in the scene, right there in all the silence and noise. The only person who doesn't conform with all this hushed reverence is the woman, Eugenia. She's intelligent, curious, she wants to understand, so she questions. What does it mean to be a woman with faith, she asks the priest. To be a mother and have children, is his reply. So her inquisitiveness quickly turns to impatience when she receives this answer that she doesn't want to hear, and she turns to leave the scene, turning her back on the glowing warmth and hushed murmuring of the other Italian women, all gathered together, praying for motherhood, while she stands alone by the cold stone walls at the back. The quiet is suddenly interrupted by the loud sound of birds escaping. The painted fresco cuts back to the Russian man, Andrei, who still hasn't moved. The scene, all of a sudden, is in stark black and white. He looks at a rural countryside. We don't know if this is in Italy or elsewhere. Again, it could be anywhere. For 6 minutes, all we've done is watched and listened, and yet again Tarkovsky has given us all the information we need. It's important to note that Tarkovsky very often employs silence as a tool in his filmmaking. But we still have to listen, because we can gather just as much information from the environmental sounds and acoustics of a scene. The atmosphere of the scene becomes the soundtrack, becomes the dialogue. Every single image, sound, and word means something in Tarkovsky's films. Nothing is included that doesn't have significance. And so this also goes for Tarkovsky's use of music. As you may realize, he uses music very sparingly in this film, and this is intentional. Firstly, when we hear musical sound, whether subconsciously or consciously, a part of our attention will be inevitably focused on hearing it. However, when there's total silence, all our focus can be directed onto the visual and sound of the scene itself. And often, this is exactly what Tarkovsky wants. He doesn't want to just direct the film, he also wants to direct our attention as we watch. But the other reason he uses music sparingly is that music for Tarkovsky, and especially by the time he made this film, isn't incidental. His appreciation and attitude towards music was such that he saw music as an entire emotional and visual world, an artistic language in itself. By virtue of what music is and does, it simply cannot be reduced to the background all the time. In his book Sculpting Time of 1986, he writes, "Music does more than intensify the impression of the visual image by providing a parallel illustration of the same idea. It opens up the possibility of a new, transfigured impression of the same material, something different in kind." Tarkovsky only ever uses music in this film if he feels like the music, in itself, makes an appropriate artistic statement of its own, to speak for itself and the central themes of the film. After all, music contains an immense amount of information, images, context, and emotions of its own, and for Tarkovsky this means that it's a powerful communicative tool in itself, and as such should be used with discretion, and only in the situations where there is an absolute certainty that it will not contradict the scene, or even worse, be misinterpreted. And this will be a very important point later on. In the following scene in a hotel, Andrei comments that he doesn't want to read an Italian translation of a Russian poet, that poetry, like all art, is untranslatable. Eugenia challenges him, quite logically. She points out that the translation is necessary to become acquainted with another country's art and works. How can someone, for instance, read a book by Tolstoy if they don't read Russian? She then goes on to mention music as an example that doesn't need any translation, to which he sings her a Russian song that she doesn't recognize. Andrei states that the only way for different people to connect with one another is to break down the borders between states and cultures, a statement that also clearly reflects his inner disapproval of the Soviet regime's foreign policy. And yet his words seem hollow. There is a border between them. The two can't see eye to eye. They sit literally facing away from each other. And while Eugenia is showing a keen interest in Russian culture and literature, showing earnest attempts to connect to it, and through doing so, connect with Andrei, he merely responds to her by saying coldly, "This film is about more than just a basic sense of nostalgia. It's about a sense of displacement, being lost and disconnected. It's about longing for a sense of familiarity, cultural and emotional, while also trying and failing to find it. It's about loss of identity in a world filled with strangers." Tarkovsky created the film to also serve as an allegory for the feelings of homesickness and alienation that many Russian émigrés felt after leaving the country in the 20th century during the Soviet regime. But this theme goes back even further in history. The character of Andrei, we learn, is a musicologist who is in Italy researching the life of the fictional 18th century Russian composer, Pavel Sosnovsky. The fictional Sosnovsky is, however, based off the real-life 18th century composer Maxim Berezovsky, who composed a great deal of Slavic spiritual choral music for the Eastern Orthodox Church. Much like his fictional counterpart, he was sent to Italy in 1769 to study in Bologna with pedagogue Giovanni Battista Martini and learn the Italian compositional style. A few years later, and Berezovsky successfully wrote an Italian opera in the Italian operatic musical style called Demofonte, set to an Italian libretto by Pietro Metastasio. This work also marked the first opera ever written by a Russian composer, and it's a complete departure from his native Slavonic style. The same year as the opera's premiere, he returned home to St. Petersburg, and died 4 years later in 1777. Many sources from the time state that his death was from suicide upon being rejected and unable to reintegrate to life in Russia and the Russian musical world following his time in Italy. While this fact is now disputed by modern musicologists, the story still remains. The fictional Sosnovsky, who is based off Berezovsky's life, suffered the same fate. Back in the film itself, Andrei has been doing his research on Sosnovsky in Italy for over 2 years, and ironically finds himself in the same position as his composer icon, feeling the exact same sense of detachment and alienation in his surroundings in Italy, longing for his home culture in Russia, but equally feeling a detachment from that too. He is unable to imagine returning after living in a totally different country, culture and life for so long. Andrei can neither live without his homeland and home culture, but nor can he now return to it. He's stuck in between two opposing sides of the same coin, neither belonging nor apart. He is, in the true sense of the word, lost between worlds, only able to feel a constant state of nostalgia for a life that everywhere he turns and looks feels distant. So we now understand what the opening sequence of the film signifies musically, the Russian folk song which blends into Verdi's Requiem, a masterpiece of the Italian repertoire. The lines and borders between the two are faded, overlapping and blending so that at one point we almost cannot discern one from the other, and yet both still sound so distinct, so different. The two pieces are from totally different worlds, not just culturally or linguistically, but even in musical form. The simple sounds of the Russian folk song stand in stark contrast to the lush romantic orchestral and choral colours of the Requiem. We can neither tell what musical world we are in, but nor can we ignore the marked differences between the two. Tarkovsky could have used a Russian work more similar to the Requiem in size or style. He could have used a symphony by Tchaikovsky, or a choral work by Bodniansky, or even Berezovsky. But he chooses a folk song, simple, rural, the most basic and ethnically pure form of Russian melody and style. This isn't grandiose or godly, it's simple homesickness. And this mixing and combining is representative of the main dramatic tool that Tarkovsky employs throughout this whole film: juxtaposition. And this is something that we see throughout the entire film. The film changes between black and white and colour as we flip between memory and the present, between Italy and Andrei's visions of his homeland back in Russia. We see scenes of rural countryside, sometimes Italy, sometimes Russia. At times we aren't even sure which is which, and because of this constant contrasting and switching and mixing, we don't feel connected with anywhere. Andrei's disconnected, introverted character is also juxtaposed with the curious, open-minded Eugenia. Eugenia's city-dwelling feminist personality is juxtaposed with the religious women of the rural town. The towns of Italy that we would generally expect to see on screen as bright and sunny, vivacious and alive are eerily quiet. Rather than golden and fresh and vibrant, everything seems time-worn, crumbling, decrepit. Town walls are covered in moss and cracks, water leaks through everywhere, everything feels forgotten. The juxtaposition continues. We discover that a general who lives in the town prefers not to listen to the aforementioned Verdi, the great Italian composer, but Chinese traditional music and chant, a genre of music that couldn't be more different. And he uses language that is so typically associated with Roman Catholic culture to describe a musical style from a totally different heritage and culture. And part of us deep down also wonders with some skepticism, just as Andrei does, how well this Italian general could possibly really understand it. Andrei begins to become frustrated by Eugenia's determination to connect with him, and yet her reluctance to accord with the things he is actually finding interesting, mainly Domenico, the village madman, who we will get onto a bit later. She, on the other hand, is frustrated that her attempts to connect with him through his native Russian culture aren't bringing her any closer to him. Eugenia's growing fascination with Andrei leads her to become infatuated with him, but despite his own unintentional growing interest in her, he only withdraws even further away into himself. And not merely because he's married, he also feels equally disconnected from his wife, doesn't make any attempts to contact her. But his growing sense of detachment seeps into every part of his life, so that even the place and people he misses, the family he knows are waiting for him, seem like just a distant memory. But his distance from Eugenia is because he feels keenly aware of the fundamental difference between them, the essential cultural divide. He becomes so detached, in fact, that both women just become abstract figures in his mind, frescoes themselves. He dreams about them. His wife, the archetype of the Madonna, she's even called Maria, the unceasingly loyal and passive woman whose role is to give birth, be a mother, and love selflessly. Eugenia is Mary Magdalene, the fierce lover, independent, active, but shunned, an outcast of society, destined to have her heart broken and be left alone. Inevitably, the cultural gap that had been an unspoken divide, a marker of distance between the two, becomes an irreconcilable chasm and destructive force, virtually breaking the friendship entirely. Eugenia's frustration brews up into a resentful anger, and she confronts Andrei, insulting him, criticizing and analyzing him in a long, heartfelt monologue. Andrei, though, still cannot either confront or comfort her. He is only able to say to himself in Russian... Nevertheless, Andrei is clearly upset by Eugenia's tirade. She finally calls him the biggest and most unfair insult to him, and he smacks her before breaking out into a nosebleed, his internal stress and emotions only able to express themselves through basic dominant masculinity and physicality. But at this moment, at the climax of all this tension and drama and aggression and misunderstanding, while Eugenia storms off and Andrei bleeds all over the floor, we hear probably one of the most inappropriate, out-of-place musical cues in film history. The general decides to put on his Chinese music. It all becomes almost comical, the sheer absurdity of the situation. How out of context the music is, not just because it's of a totally different culture now, but because it contrasts with the whole tone of this scene. The music is a Buddhist chant. It's intended for calm, peace, and introverted reflection, not exactly the loud and passionate outburst we've just witnessed. Everything here now feels disconnected and juxtaposed. It's a brilliant use of timing on Tarkovsky's part to firstly set us up earlier in the film, and then deploy the music right in this moment. Ironically then, much like this double-sided coin that we've mentioned, this musical cue is appropriately inappropriate. The tragedy of this scene is that the outburst isn't because the characters dislike each other per se. It's because there is a type of barrier between them that simply cannot be overcome. It runs too deep. It's about intangible roots. But even so, while watching all this drama, even we as an audience feel strangely disconnected. We observe what happens, but not with empathy, just a strange sense of acknowledgement, but detachment. Now, one reason for this is simply Tarkovsky's style. His characters are often personifications representing an idea or a point of view, and their place in his films are symbolic of a particular motif, point of view, or theme, which can make them at times feel almost inhuman. His narrative method is more a meditation on a subject, an intellectual exercise, and not so much storytelling between people, which is why his films can sometimes be quite hard to watch and leave people feeling somewhat cold or indifferent to the characters. Nevertheless, there are moments, like this one, where his characters have very human outbreaks of emotion that drive the narrative in a particular direction. Music, in a soundtrack, is one of the quickest and simplest ways to make an audience quickly connect with the characters or drama on screen. It's almost a basic rule of filmmaking, the soundtrack as a means of creating empathy with the characters, without them actually having to say anything.
I wish I could think of something to say.
Now, as we've said, Tarkovsky tends to use music very carefully. However, in his previous films, he does use soundtracks, even with a composer creating a full soundtrack for the film. For Ivan's Childhood in 1962 and Andrei Rublev in 1966, Tarkovsky worked with Soviet composer Vyacheslav Ovchinnikov, using the soundtrack in the traditional way of setting mood and helping dramatize the events and emotions in the film. Soviet electronic composer Eduard Artemyev composed the scores for his next three films, Solaris in 1972, Mirror 1975, and Stalker in 1979. And Tarkovsky again uses juxtaposition in these films, but this time using a combination of original soundtrack and of pre-existing classical music. Tarkovsky said, "Music has always had a rightful place in my films, and has been important and precious. But with Nostalghia in 1983, Tarkovsky made a total departure. There is no soundtrack written for it at all. The very few tracks he uses are from pre-existing works and recordings, and in total there are only 4 used. But the vast majority of the film passes by in silence. During the whole of Eugenia's emotional lovesick outburst, during Andrei's short physical outburst, everything remains silent. There's no great swelling of violins, no oboes pulling at any heartstrings, as we might expect from the various examples of, well, pretty much any other film set in Italy dealing with affairs of the heart. Nope. But here's the thing, in this film, as we know, Tarkovsky is actively trying to illustrate the feeling of detachment. And remember, if music is a tool for creating an emotional connection and bridge between the audience and the film, in this case, with what this film is all about, music is then something Tarkovsky wants to actively avoid. He wants us to feel detached. And denying us any music to help us empathize with his characters is his way of making us empathize with the characters and the emotional core of disconnection. But aside from trying to alienate us from the characters, another reason for this is purely dramatic. It's not a romance scene. There is no romance here, that's the point. Despite all the emotion expressed, there is no exchange of emotion between Andrei and Eugenia because they can't connect. And despite their efforts, this is again because of the invisible cultural barrier between the two of them. There is no mutual flow of emotional energy or understanding here. And so, what would be the point in having music? We only hear the next piece of recognizable classical music at 45 minutes into the film, and with all the silence we've had up until now, it's almost deafening. It comes unexpectedly and again in a strange moment. Domenico, the aforementioned village madman, lives in a decrepit, leaking house on the edge of the town. The villagers don't understand Domenico. He was once an educated man with a degree and a family, but his past and his current state is clearly disturbed. And yet, Andrei is fascinated by his semi-psychotic apocalyptic ramblings, seeing in him a person completely disconnected with not only the world, but seemingly with reality. And yet, in the prophetic philosophical statements that Domenico makes, Andrei finds someone who seems ironically more connected with how the world is, in all its many tragic, terrible, impermanent and beautiful forms, than anyone else. Domenico, for Andrei, is a speaker of truth. It's simply a truth that the townspeople don't understand. And Andrei finds in Domenico a foothold into something which he believes out of his own increasing disconnection with life he can connect to, hold on to. Domenico gives Andrei faith. Not necessarily of the religious kind, but a reason to hold on to something. This is represented by the candle that Domenico tries to keep alight as he crosses the drained pool every day, each time for it to be snuffed out. As Andrei explores Domenico's house, filled with broken items and nonsensical elements, he stands by a mantelpiece with objects like a clock frozen in time, scattered on top of it, like a still life. And during all of this, we hear the 4th movement of Beethoven's Symphony 9. And as we reach one of the explosive choruses in this movement, it suddenly, mid-phrase, cuts out. Domenico asks if Andrei recognized it. This is only the 2nd use of diegetic music in the film. That is, music that also exists within the narrative, so the characters hear it themselves.
Hai sentito? È Beethoven.
Beethoven 9's Ode to Joy is an interesting choice, however. It certainly wasn't the first time it had been used in cinema, famously of course in Stanley Kubrick's Clockwork Orange of 1971, and also in the final scenes of Tarkovsky's previous film, Stalker. Interesting to note, though, Tarkovsky had a lifelong ideological and artistic antagonism towards Kubrick's filmmaking. Solaris was as much an artistic and ideological response to Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey as it was a film. Much like the character Andrei in the film Nostalghia, who Tarkovsky of course named after himself, Tarkovsky often found himself stuck in between two places. He was disapproving of the Soviet regime, of what Russia had turned into, and yet he was equally disapproving of the hard individualism of the West. And this also extended to his taste in composers. While he loved classical music on the whole, and especially Bach, as Tobias Pontara puts it in his book, Andrei Tarkovsky's Sounding Cinema, later in life he developed a growing impatience with much of Western art music, and romantic music in particular, associating it with an unhealthy individualistic aesthetic, characterized above all by a neurotic obsession with one's own raptures and agonies. And this also included Beethoven. But it isn't that Tarkovsky disapproves of Beethoven's music, rather he disagrees with its message. Tarkovsky wrote, "The West is forever shouting, 'This is me, look at me, listen to me suffering, loving, how unhappy I am, how happy, I, mine, me.'" And in 1985, he described the music of Beethoven as an unending monologue about oneself. I. Schiller's Ode to Joy, as set by Beethoven in this symphony, is after all a celebration of humankind, human power, human resilience, and the human will to life. It's a work that's been extensively discussed, and various musicologists such as Richard Taruskin have commented on the fact that there is no real definitive meaning to what Beethoven was intending with this poem and with this piece. But one thing is for certain, it is intended as a celebration of existence. The crisis Andrei now finds himself in is an existential one. So, in this moment, in the home of a man at loss with reality, with a man equally lost in himself, we hear a cruel, ironic take on this symphony. If we interpret this music as an individualistic statement on Beethoven's part, on his own personal political views, it contrasts with the reality on screen of these two lost people. There is no individual here. If we see the music as a statement of fraternity, union, again it's ironic. Both characters long for a sense of connection and yet are incapable and unable to find it. Either way, the music is juxtaposed with this existential pathos. The symphony reappears one more time at the very end of the film. Domenico, having reached his limit, travels to Rome and announces a prophetic message about society. All the people around him stand apart from one another as they look on passively and unsympathetically at him. This time, Domenico is not setting light to his candle, but to himself in an act of self-immolation. He demands for his music of choice to be played, Beethoven IX's Ode to Joy. It doesn't work at first, but eventually, after some effort, the music gurgles its way into life. The people around make no attempts to stop him, only a dog cries out in horror and sympathy. And as the lyrics shout out, it's a terrifying, deeply moving and brutal scene in which Tarkovsky uses once more juxtaposition to contrast the various opposing elements. Something to note is that both of Tarkovsky's choices of the Verdi Requiem and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony share the same tonality of D minor, considered to be the darkest and most melancholy of all keys, appropriate for the general tone of this film. However, in the fourth movement of this symphony, Beethoven moves through to the parallel major of D major for the chorus of the Ode to Joy, a complete opposite, like sunlight coming in after a dark night, bright and full of hope, reflecting the optimistic and gleeful tone of the chorus. But in this instance, and used in this context, again Tarkovsky perverts this feeling into one that is ironic, sarcastic, and opposite to what we see. The Ode to Joy and its D major sounds more like a mockery than a celebration. The criticism of society and disconnection that both the character of Domenico and Tarkovsky are making in this scene are re-emphasized by their juxtaposition to the Ode to Joy. We do also have to remember that this film was made in the 1980s, at a time when the world was barely recovering from a barrage of wars, dictatorships, and totalitarian governments. And this is shown in the ironic use of Beethoven's Ode to Joy. The tragedy of Domenico, who longs for humanity to reconnect, and the cruelty and indifference of a society that is already detached, soulless, and broken. The scenes that are left beautifully wrap up the film and its themes in totality, though after all we've covered, they can easily speak for themselves if you go watch them. Others have already spoken about Tarkovsky's brilliant manipulation of time in the famous 9-minute-long one-take candle scene, but without seeing the whole film itself, it's impossible to understand fully. And actually, this is the final and crucial message of the entire film, that all people in the end want to connect, to be understood, but we can only connect, empathize with one another, with cultures, ideas, things, if we understand them in themselves. Without being able to appreciate what the thing is, we will never be able to understand it or connect with it. This is also the point of that conversation about translation, when Andrei claims that things are untranslatable. Translation can only distort the original meaning and essence. And in a way, it's futile, because by translating, by trying to turn something into our own way of seeing things, is not understanding the thing directly in itself. The troubled Domenico often speaks some sense in his own very particular way of seeing things, but the reason why people dismiss him is because they don't want to understand him, and because they can't even translate his behavior, they shun him. This is why the only person who doesn't try to translate his actions, Andrei, is the only character who understands him for who he is, and so can connect to him. He doesn't think he's mad, simply misunderstood. Eugenia wants to try and understand faith and the church, but without accepting what it is, she will never be able to understand it. Andrei's rejection of Eugenia doesn't really come from the fact that she's from a different background in the end, but because she tried to connect with him by translating him into something else, something that she could understand in her own vocabulary of people, and thus not really trying to understand him himself. And this goes the reverse way. Andrei, despite being brutally aware of the problem of translation, is himself so caught up in his own Russian melancholy, he cannot even begin to empathize with Eugenia's behavior or thought processes, or her pain, calling her, not Domenico, the mad person, hence Eugenia's blaming him of hypocrisy. All the characters suffer the same problem of feeling disconnected and detached, because they're all stuck in the same predicament, of being misunderstood. And the same goes for art and culture. Andrei doesn't want to see the frescoes at the beginning of the film, not because he isn't interested, but because he's afraid that as a Russian, he will be unable to understand them properly in the way a Roman Catholic Italian can. In an interview on the film, Tarkovsky said, "Contained in those monuments is the heart and soul of those who made them, who conceived them, and around them are the people who don't see them in an abstract way, but in concrete terms because they live there or experience them, because they are part of their daily panoramas or the rhythms of their existence." What did the professor know of all this? Nothing. And speaking of Andrei being Russian, even the titular Nostalghia is a concept which we can only understand in itself. Translating it changes the meaning. Nostalgia, as it is also portrayed in this film, is something that is a quintessential part of Russian culture and psychology. In English, nostalgia means a sentimental longing or missing the past, but nostalgia for Russians is about the deep-set psychological melancholy and detachment that comes with missing familiarity, home, and that connection. If we understand it as this, we understand better not only this film, but Russian culture and people. Tarkovsky even said that the film is probably the most Russian of my films for this precise reason. But if we just translate it into English, nostalgia, it becomes something totally different. It loses its actual meaning. And if it loses this, how can we understand and connect to it? Now, Tarkovsky was certainly not the first Russian person to draw on the concept of nostalgia for artistic inspiration. It's a theme present in all kinds of Russian works, from the author Dostoevsky to the composer Tchaikovsky, unsurprisingly perhaps one of Tarkovsky's most beloved composers. Just listen to this music, and you can hear it, feel it. But it's not even just Russia. Every culture, every language, every person has their own unique peculiarities and essence. Take Italian. In English, we listen to music. If we translate that straight into Italian, we would have ascoltare la musica. But that's actually wrong. That isn't how you would say this in Italian. In Italian, you say sentire la musica, to feel music. So here's the point. If we understand this, can this subtle but important difference help us understand and connect with Italian culture and people? But it's not that we have to speak every single language in the world, that's crazy, or pronounce everything perfectly. It's just enough to be aware that these differences do exist. In the case of art, film, or music, it doesn't necessarily need or use language, and so without the so-called language barrier, it has the power to speak to us in a more direct way, which is why just listening to this symphony here, we can grasp the idea of nostalgia without need for words. Tarkovsky said that cinema and music have a poetic meaning that manifests itself to us directly. But even then, he admits that there's still the risk of cultural barriers causing misunderstanding. He said, "The only art that reaches everyone directly is music. The others, if you are not in the midst of them, if you don't experience them, they have only barriers surrounding them." Translation: art cannot manage to move inside it. It is there, imprisoned, and an imprisoned art, yes, certainly, is always a betrayed art. So, for Tarkovsky, if we want to connect, we have to understand. And in this film, he's not only trying to show us disconnection through misunderstanding, but through art is trying to help us understand the Russian concept of nostalgia. Because you can't just put life into Google Translate. For Tarkovsky, film, music, people, art, cultures are untranslatable. We can only understand them if we try to understand them in and of themselves.